Hi, everyone, and welcome to Textile Talks. I'm Carolyn Ducey at the International Quilt Museum, located at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. The International Quilt Museum proudly stewards and exhibits the world's largest collection of quilts and related textiles that span 5 centuries and over 65 countries. In fact, that is our mission and our passion to build a global collection and audience that celebrates the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. If this is your passion too, and you aren't already a member, we would love to have you join us. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize and thank the organizations that partner with the International Quilt Museum to bring you Textile Talks each week: the Quilt Alliance, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. We're honored to bring you free and inspiring programming with the help of our sponsors, and we couldn't do it without their generosity and the generosity of viewers like you. Just a couple reminders before we get started today. Please use the Q&A for any questions. The chat box is for greeting others and for the survey and opportunity for you to give us some feedback on how we can improve Textile Talks. If you prefer not to see notifications from the chat, you can click on the chat button to toggle them off or on. The live captions make Textile Talks accessible to a wider audience. If you prefer not to view captions, you should be able to turn them off. Next week's talk is going to be terrific. We have the Quilt Alliance presenting Document That Quilt. Yes, even that one. And I am such a fan of documenting your quilt, so I think everybody needs to be sure to watch our Textile Talk next week and get some great information about how best to document your quilts. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I am really, really thrilled to be here today with a very special program. I don't know about you all, but I'm glued to my television every night these 16 days of the Olympics, and watching all the sports has been such an inspiration. And we are so fortunate today to hear from Grace Latz, who is an Olympian herself. Grace represented the United States at the 2016 Olympics. She's a rower and also was a national champion. So she, in 2015, was a world rowing champion. And Grace is bringing us a wonderful story about a quilt that she made as part of a relatively new program with the Olympics called the Artist Olympian program. It just began in 2018, so she's going to tell us a little bit more about that. She was one of only 4 Olympians chosen for the program this year to do a piece of artwork in Paris for the Olympic event. It's on display there now. And unfortunately, because Grace is a member of the U.S. team, she's an advisor to the rowing team, and she's announcing some of the rowing events. She's not able to be with us live here today. So we are just so grateful for her giving us some time as she was literally packing for Paris to videotape a lecture and have her share the information about this wonderful program and her quilt. And we couldn't absolutely prove this, but Grace and I both agreed that this the quilt that she made, which will become a part of the permanent collection of the Olympic Museum in Lausanne, Switzerland, is definitely the very first quilt in their collection and possibly the very first textile piece in that collection. So this is really exciting. So we do not have Grace live, but we do have a wonderful discussion that she and I had that we've recorded, so we're going to go ahead and listen to that. If you have questions as we're going along, certainly post them. I'll try to answer them if I can, but Grace has also shared her email with us at the end of this program, so we can you can also email Grace directly with any questions. So let's go ahead and enjoy this program with Grace Latz.
Full Circle is the title of the quilt that I made through this project that we're here to talk about. And for me, it really is full circle to be able to implement this project and draw on my experience as an athlete. So just thrown up here, you can get a little sneak peek of what it looked like, but we'll talk more about the details as we go through it. So you'll see how the project actually evolved. So you can click through the next slide, and it's really about me. So I'm a 2016 Olympian. In the Rio Olympics, I was in the women's quad. So that's that photo on the lower right-hand screen. So what that is, it's a 4 oarswoman boat. Each person has 2 oars each. And I was bow seat, which means that I'm the person who is using my voice to execute the race plan. I'm also there to help navigate and technically there to balance out any kinds of stuff that's going on. But also, as you can tell from that photo, I'm also almost the shortest person in the boat, and I'm 6 foot tall. But through my time, I started as a walk-on student athlete at the University of Wisconsin. Rowing is a sport that you don't have to be good early. In fact, I tell people a lot of rowers aren't at the elite level until they're 24, which is largely after your college experience is over anyways. So it was great that I was a walk-on in college. Through that, it was a really cool experience. Had good success at the collegiate level, and then advanced on to rowing for a club, Vesper Boat Club in Philadelphia, and then later to the national team. So my first national team was in 2014. In 2015, I was world champion in a different event, women's 4. So also 4 women, but 1 oar per person. So within rowing, you have those 2 disciplines, which really boils down to, is it 1 or 2 oars per person? But all in all, I was on the national team 4 times. I've also gotten into announcing. I'm an athlete rep and textile artist, but if you go to the next slide, you'll see some more good pictures that kind of describe some of that. So this kind of shows you a little bit more of like what the boats are like. At least in my experience, I've rowed in both sweep and scull. That's the difference between the 2 oars and the 1. So if you see the photo of me waving, that's actually me after the final in the Olympics, waving off to my family that I spotted. But and then the photo next to that, that's me in 2017 at the World Championships in the women's 8.
Wow.
And so this is kind of sprinkling in here some of the different boats that I've been part of, and I'm catching myself that I doubled up the photos, but all because I enjoyed that moment. But also what I've been really grateful for is that, you know, in my athlete experience, when you also retire, it's sort of difficult to figure out what your place is after that, because it's such a big part of your identity, right? And so I got pulled into doing announcing because I had so much contact with the athletes after I had left through being an athlete representative. So I'm on the US Rowing Athlete Council, so I bring the athlete perspective and voice to pretty much all the decisions that get made about the national team. And so I'm on a council of 10 people. I'm in the leadership group, and I've followed a lot of the men and women who are going to be competing or have competed in Paris by the time you see this. So it meant a lot to me to then also be brought into announcing at different levels. So I've done everything now in the last 2 years, between the national championship for the high school level all the way up to the Big Ten championships, NCAAs. And also I announced this year's US rowing, or the US national team Olympic and Paralympic trials. So
Wow.
it's been
Exciting to see your career just advance and advance like that. Wow.
Yeah, and I think part of the parallel that ties that all together is I tell people I didn't make the Olympic team because I was the fastest or the strongest. Because everyone in my time was incredibly competitive and the talent pool was very, very deep. But in looking back, and something I knew was a strength of mine at the time, was that I'm somebody in boats and in different combinations that there's an X factor of people understood that when they got in a boat with me, they were going to go faster. But it was because we're all as a unit going faster. Like, I make sure that we're all on the same page. I'm trying to make sure everyone's feedback's incorporated. It's really about the boat and the unit more so than any one individual. So I felt it's very important to consider a lot of different perspectives and meet people where they're at, but also keep people on track and on goal. So that was something that really paid off for me as an athlete and really got me into securing that last spot for that 2016 Olympic team.
Wow.
Over, a lot of people, but also is something that I carry with me through a lot of different applications. So one of those transferable skills that I've had as an athlete into kind of real life. And that's why it's been such a joy to continue that shining of athlete voices and athlete experience through to like what you would be seeing during the Olympic coverage or Paralympic coverage.
Wow.
So it's been a really huge honor and kind of something I didn't expect, but I'm along for the ride. I'm here for it.
I love that you
mission.
added this and added some more background, because one of the things I was really curious about is while you're rowing and working for years towards that goal, you are also then an artist.
Yeah, and I've always had this like creative streak. Um, and so for me, it was actually, it's something I laugh about with some of my high school friends. I was the art nerd who, for some reason, found a sport and became an Olympian. But then on the other hand, one of my good friends was like a 3-season athlete, went to college for basketball, and then ended up being a graphic designer and the art nerd. But I find these parallel to each other because it's like you're talking about. It's the vision, the focus, the breaking it down into goals. It's, depending on what you do, there's collaboration with other people, there's mastering skills, learning new things, it's feedback, getting, there's a lot of the things that make you a good athlete make you an artist as well. And I think sometimes conversations about sports often err towards the focusing on the end or like on the outcome. But when you're in, what medal did you get? Where'd you place? Where are you? What's on your business card? But not, but the day-to-day situation is a lot more like art, where you're just kind of chipping away at goals and things that you want to do because you're kind of obsessed with like wanting to do the next thing and do the next thing better. So for me, art and sport are very similar. And I think that was a lot for people to wrangle with. But when I was training, I mean, all the way through college into my sporting career, I was always knitting, sewing, doing watercolors, like just doing things with my hands all the time because it was part of like my mental process. Um, and actually, when I started on at Wisconsin, I was an art student. And had I not found that I could have a future in rowing, I was prepped to go on to architecture school. But you can only be an Olympian and pursue this within a certain time frame. So I went that route. But I think I've always had that sort of design mindset. But I included here, some of the like textile type work I've done with knitting, because that was kind of like one of my first loves. But within the quilting and fabric space, my grandmother was a huge quilter. All the women in her family were quilters. And then she passed that on to her daughters. And so I have an aunt who's a quilt artist, but like every single one of my dad's sisters quilts. And then my mom picked up quilting when she moved to the Midwest. She had sewn a lot of clothing and a lot of those other types of things, but so I was around it a lot. And it was actually once I stopped rowing did I find more art quilt type work, and went through a couple of workshops and created some was introduced some new processes that were really exciting to me because I'd made some quilts before here and there, and I've sewn different projects. But for me, it was frustrating because I don't know if it's just the way my brain works or my personality, but like following a pattern to a T and having to have all the straight lines and angles line up, I can do it, but it drives me crazy. And I do obviously for rowing too, like I want to excel and master things. So like I will get obsessed until I get it right, but it wasn't enjoyable for me in this space. So when I found some other ways to adapt fabrics through this kind of more art quilt direction, it was really engaging for me. So
Felt at home.
I've done a lot of like fun, surprising things with it that were smaller scale projects. Compared to what this Olympian Artist program is, but I had done, a couple of like landscapes and portraits and different design type things. But really the largest piece I'd really done was somewhere between like 3 to 5 feet as like a wall hanging or something like that. But I really enjoyed the process of because I had known how to do a lot of these quilting processes, using them in surprising ways or incorporating unique materials. So that's kind of what the pictures on the left are depicting. But then also parallel to all of that happening, why I even started out as an art student, going back to when I was in high school, I've always been drawn towards collaborative art and wanting people to be included in the experience. So something that kind of collage is portraying is, so before moving back to Michigan, I lived in Colorado after I had retired from rowing. And about 2 years into that, the town I was living in experienced a large wildfire, the East Troublesome Fire. And it was the state's second largest wildfire. And of the residents who lived in our town, I believe about a third to a half of them lost their homes. It was a huge travesty to our area. And we lived on the west entrance of Rocky Mountain National Park, so it's also a very visible community. But a lot of the impact happened with the residents, not so much what tourists would see. So I'm a communications professional, so I was, aside from being personally affected, I did not lose my home, but from, friends and neighbors and things who were experiencing a lot of hardship. But then also professionally, I was helping manage the response to this and disseminating information, but also the recovery, and then also balancing, you got to be able to have people enjoy their national park, but also acknowledge that there was this really crazy experience. So through work, we put together this mini museum and exhibit about that, but we really wanted to focus on how can we help the community. And something that we did as a team was create these series of events around the anniversary of that wildfire experience. And part of that program was doing this community kind of collaborative project that I came up with, which was I went into the fire scar and I collected ash from the wood that had burned. I want to say over 200,000 acres had burned. So there was a lot to go through. But I took ash from that and I made paint. And then at one of our anniversary events, invited people to put down a mark for every person they feel like was part of this experience for them. And kind of, as you can see in this picture, profiled it in a way so that eventually they make a tree ring. And for us, and in that area and ecosystem, fire does initiate some rebirth and regrowth. But I think it was also helpful for people to see their marks next to others, because this happened during the pandemic where people couldn't really connect with each other. So that's another way that I've kind of used art to connect people. So while I've done it a lot in sport now, for this project that we're about to talk about, I feel like these are all different threads that have come together to bring me to why I'm talking to you today.
Oh, that's amazing. And what a healing experience for people to understand that they shared what they went through. I think that's so important for people.
Yeah.
Wow. So you've been a creator all your life. So
I have, and it's, I've gone back and forth between like what it is. And I feel like because I wasn't a professional artist, like, can you really call yourself that? But I feel like I've learned through this Olympian thing that, if you do something, you are that. So I guess I am an artist.
I agree. Absolutely. Definitely.
Yeah. But you can click it onto the next slide and we can start talking about the Olympian project.
This is so cool. And I will admit, I was not familiar with this Olympian Artist program before you got in touch. So I think this is really great.
Yeah.
So tell us all about this. How did you get involved?
Yeah, so it's actually a relatively new program, so I'm not surprised if it was new, because it's only been around since 2018, though art with the Olympics has been around since the beginning of the modern Olympics. They actually, in early iterations, wanted to have not just an evaluation of sport, but also art. So like in Pierre Coubertin's like original idea of the Olympics, you would also be an Olympian artist, not just in your sport, but like, so that's kind of, it's just that idea never took off, but you always see, Olympic edition posters, and there's all this art engagement around the around the Olympics every time. And I remember during my Rio Olympics, they did have a photographer come in and take headshots of everybody, and then they plastered them up on all of the walls, and you'd have Olympians next to the janitors, next to the PT, next to the food prep people, like everyone who was in the village got documented, and then it was this like public art experience. I thought that was so cool, because that wasn't something to sell, that wasn't something to they didn't need to do that, but it was like a cool way of bringing people together and kind of reminding them all of what is involved with the games. And I think through that, they realized, well, like the IOC was thinking, well, why can't we engage our Olympians to do some projects like this? Like, this would be really awesome. So their first edition was in 2018. And I had actually applied for the 2020 version with a different idea entirely. And that proposal had been accepted. But then with the postponement of that games, and because that project was also collaborative in nature, they had to nix it. And I totally get it. But I was really excited when I saw that they were going to have another version of it. So they brought it back for 2024. And it took me maybe like a week or two to think about it, because I had thought, well, if something came along, what would I do? And I submitted my proposal kind of a little bit on a whim, but when I came up with this idea, I was feeling pretty confident they would like it. Because they had branched out. They originally they had one call to action of people creating studio art and sending it in, and that was that. But my project in 2020 was collaborative and engaged people. And the IOC really does, from what you see on TV of the sporting events, definitely a huge part of what they do. But there's so much work on the ground with like volunteers and like transportation and prepping the city to be able to host this kind of stuff, down to, every single time an IOC group comes in to just check on progress, they always use the locations, they pour money in locally to the economy. They check in with a lot of stuff. And so they really liked the idea of having a collaborative avenue. So there were two directions you could take with your proposal: this studio art, send it in, or propose working with people, and how would you do it? And that was kind of its own segment. So I applied this idea, and I included here this image of what I put in my proposal, which was basically, what could I make a giant Olympic flag, bringing together different sport materials that we all recognize as being this kind of performance fabric, but in a way that's separate from any team or country or sport. And we just know that it's sport, and it's not about the level that you've competed at. It's not about, the end. It's not about medals. It's about doing it and being part of it and contributing to it. So that what's included there is one of my concept photos that I submitted with my proposal. And I specifically identified, I want to be able to use recycled fabrics. I want them to be sports fabrics for all the reasons I just listed. But then the communities I want to work with, I specifically want to work with seniors of some sort, older women, because I feel like when we talk about the Olympics and when we talk about sports, so much focus is on the biggest, the fastest, and the strongest, the flashiest, and all of that's usually in the like prime of people's youth. And I think that we forget that we got there through other people, through mentorship, through coaching, through people supporting us, that support came from people older than us. And I'm very hyper aware because of, my involvement with Wisconsin, Title IX, and my mom didn't have the same sport opportunities I had, purely because the access didn't exist. My grandmother was qualified and was trying to pursue a career in dance and in ballet, and that was socially unacceptable for her family. And like how far we've come along, but also this has been within our lifetime, which is crazy. And a lot of the other three artists within the community program piece selected, I want to engage youth. I want to inspire the youth, like people who have, thinking about getting them to the next level. But it's also there are people who've already been here that we can engage. And I think that's really cool. And so there's some pictures here of the group I worked with. But that was kind of part of my proposal. I sent it off in the early summertime last year, and then heard back that I had been one of 4 selected out of over 100 Olympians from around the world. And I was excited, super elated. But then from there on out, it was crazy good chaos, but also it was cool to get started right away.
Wow. Well, I love that you brought in seniors. I do think that's everything, we're built on other people's shoulders. And I think that's such a beautiful way to acknowledge that.
Yeah. But the next slide, I've got some more. So this is the end product. So I want you to keep this in mind. So that I showed you my concept idea. And then this is how it ended up being. And it's so funny to me that literally some of the stuff happened exactly as the proposal, of like down to there being some stripes in the corner, there being some mesh jerseys like that, there being shoelaces and stuff. So it's really funny that I started off with this idea, and then walking through it, I kind of had an outline, but wasn't sure how it was actually going to come together exactly. But then when I compare them back and forth, I'm really surprised that
is amazing.
Yeah, but there were some like kind of fun additions that I wouldn't have thought to add, but it came through because it's a collaborative project. Um, but I can talk more about that, but it ended up being a lot more like literally colorful because of that, and I think a lot more energetic. So it was definitely a really cool outcome. And very so this is the kind of finished product, and I'll be revisiting it when I'm in Paris, because all of the Olympian artwork is going to be on display at Clubhouse 24, which is one of the hospitality spaces for the IOC. So I've seen it completely finished, but even all the women I worked with didn't. So I'll also be meeting back up with them. They're invited to that space, so we'll have a little bit of a reunion, which is also really fun.
Oh, they're gonna love seeing it done. That's so cool.
Yeah, they saw it pretty close to done, but I think this is even better that they get access to experiencing some more Olympic fun. But yeah, but into the process, that those next steps are on the next slide. So materials. I knew I wanted to use recycled fabrics, and we had talked before too that there's like a lot of focus on just like the environmental impact of textile production and whatnot.
Right.
And I think also with sports too, there's a lot generated for different events that, you've got a volunteer working at a 5K fun run that's got a shirt, there's all of that. Then kids outgrow stuff or things wear out, or, there's a lot of stuff. So it was very important to the IOC that when I start that I have to use fabric from France. So it meant that I couldn't prepare anything before I actually arrived, which was a bit stressful. But my first day, that myself and my mother arrived because I wanted my mom to come, because I think, as we talked about, like quilting is also intergenerational as well. It's something that often gets handed down, the knowledge about it, but then I think also the execution is collaborative. So she was there kind of as a soundboard. But after we landed, first thing we did was go to this recycle center just outside the city limits, where this is a place that takes in like kayaks and volleyball nets and taekwondo jackets and tents. And we were like sorting through all this stuff, and I selected like these huge bags full of sports that I knew were part of the Olympic program. And it was funny because a lot of it was in French, but a lot of it was in English, or some of it was from test events the year before, because to prepare for the Olympics, often host cities will have some sort of test event, like a junior Olympics or some big world championships or whatever. So like what I made with this little Eiffel Tower eventually was part of a beach volleyball tournament that had already happened. And there was a lot of stuff that already had Olympic rings on it. And this wasn't curated recycled material. This is stuff that I just like found.
Wow.
And then on top of that, I contributed some items of my own from my own journey. And so with the picture, that's me flashing a little motion W there because I went to the University of Wisconsin. So I cut up one of my college unis. And I think for us, like for people who are American specifically, t-shirt quilts are really popular to commemorate someone's sport experience or something like that. So that's kind of one of the base ideas of how I came up with this idea, is because especially within rowing, because you get these shirts that are about like, NCAA's, Big Tens, or the CalSag Invitational. You've got all these sporting things, and our boathouse at Wisconsin has t-shirt quilts hung. So it was very important to me that I make sure that I put in some of my own. So that's in there. But I think challenges leading up to before we even arrived was securing the right kind of sewing machine, because in order to achieve something this big, because it was quite sizable, I needed to have a long arm. And they kept sending me pictures with this little like, oh, we found this in the basement. It's like a $50 machine from Sears. I'm like, ooh, like, unless you want me to apply for residency in France, like this really is not going to happen on the timeline you'd want it to unless I get a long arm. So it took some process, but I ended up finding actually the only machine in France that could do this.
Oh my gosh.
And it was through the supplier of the machine that my mom uses, and they had a studio, like show space. And so I was really lucky that the senior center the IOC selected for me to work with, Cour, was really only about a 15-20 minute metro ride to the sewing center. So Yeah, that was a happy accident. But then also the selection of Coulancourt, the senior center, it's part of a space where it has all the social activities, different clubs, different workshops, different events meet there. But then the upper levels also have space for residents. And it was centered in the 18th arrondissement, which is Montmartre, and then it has like a ton of background in being the stomping grounds of a lot of famous artists. So it was
Mhm.
cool to sort of nerd out about walking the streets that Van Gogh was on or Renoir and just like doing this kind of crazy impressionist art quilt.
That's so cool. Yeah, you were continuing the tradition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So on that next slide, I think I've got some more in-depth pictures. But yeah, so my process was I really had 3 full-day workshops at this senior center where we, on the first day, sorted through all the fabric and organized it by color, and then ended up ripping it apart and preparing it into these sheets. And then the third day, assembling these rings. And this whole time, both the members and then also people from the IOC were kind of like, at first they were like, oh, we see the vision. And then once we were in the thick of the process, they were like, what's going, like, I don't know what's going on, but it's cool. It's fun. We're with it. And then once we started making the rings, they could see it. And there was like all this momentum and excitement. And so that was really rewarding to see. And then it was about 4 or 5 days stacked, kind of staggered with those workshops to go to the sewing center, the Coup de Prairie, and actually, putting all of this together. But then also some late nights and early mornings at our Airbnb. Doing some things by hand, or my mom and I like moving the furniture to the side. And poor neighbors above and below us, because we were trying to, because this is a sizable piece. It's about 6 foot by 10 foot. And working in an old historic district of Paris. I'm glad our VO had a pretty sizable living room. I'll say that.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, that's a lot of work to do in a very, very short time.
Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of goes to that like athlete perspective, right? Like on top of like my personal role of being in bow often within my lineups, I have to be able to communicate the plan. I have to be able to make the plan. I was a navigator, so it's like I have to figure out how are we going to get from A to B safely and everyone understands. So that was also applying to this, not everyone can see what we're doing. Exactly like rowing, you're sitting backwards and everyone but the navigator is not supposed to look outside the boat. So there's a lot of parallels for me in this process, to bringing people from the beginning to the end of it. And it was a lot of planning and it was a lot of spreadsheets. And
Mhm.
even the IOC afterwards was like, wow, like if it's really interesting to see like how much logistics go into quilting, just like sports, like they're there planning all the
True.
events, the opening, the closing, the transportation. They're like, wow, this is actually like really similar.
It is. It is. And you really have developed amazing leadership skills. And
Yeah,
so now you're just putting them to work in a textile format.
absolutely.
Love
Yeah.
them.
So the next slide has even like more detail of just like what it was like every day. And what I loved is that I was just meeting a ton of people. I mean, there largely was probably about 40 people involved, mostly women and a few men from the sewing center. So it was really cool to be able to learn a lot about these different individuals. And the world's such a small place. One of the women, she said, the last time I was in America, I was visiting a nephew, and I was in, I was there for about 2 weeks, and it was really beautiful. And where did you say you lived? And when I was training, and during the time that she had said she had visited, I was in Princeton. That was where the training center was for my events. And she was like, I was in Princeton. I
Oh my
was like,
gosh.
and we were describing, and we came to find out that we were probably in Princeton at the exact same time. And we were referencing the same gelato shops and the same grocery stores. And, and it's all through this like kind of language barrier too, right? Like I had taken French in high school and in college, but she didn't speak any English. And but it was so cool. Like you never know who you know. And the world is so small and connected. There were so many instances like that. But it was really neat to have, meet those women, and then also extended members from the IOC who came in, because the project leads the main contacts from the IOC were like, you really should see kind of what this workshop's like. It's been really fun. So the woman in the red cardigan is the director of the Office for, or the Olympic Foundation for Culture and Heritage. And so she oversees the Olympic Museum in Lausanne, where eventually like my piece will be part of their collection. And you know, they oversee a lot of really cool cultural programs, both to just kind of memorialize the Olympic experience and all that goes into it, but then also kind of the Olympics is about sports, yeah, but it's also about culture and can move culture forward. So, you know, before Title IX, the Olympics were one of the really only sporting events that allowed women to compete. And then when they started to set the bar of like, we need to have more women, we need to do more of this, like that allowed opportunities, that incentivized opportunities at a national level to have more women represented. So in 1976 was the first, you know, Olympic experience for women. And then that goes down to the state levels and the local levels. And rowing is actually one of the most, I think it's the largest by number women's Division I sport, offering the most scholarships, and by numbers, purely like one of the largest things. You've got, for every school that has a large football program with a body of water, I sure bet you there's probably a women's rowing team. And so it's just kind of neat to see, to be part of a cultural experience that, you know, in some way, shape, or form, 100 years ago, had some sort of influence on me being able to carry that baton.
That is amazing. Yeah. And we are a big global community. And I think that's one of the things that the Olympics does so beautifully. And I love that you experience that on such a personal level.
Yeah. Yeah. And to talk about like a little bit about the process too, that I kind of alluded to, there was some, I don't want to call it happy accidents, but I didn't know they weren't in my original concept drawing. I knew working with seniors, I was going to have to make sure I could accommodate all levels of ability. And there tended to be a lot of those who signed up who had had previous sewing experience, whether it was, you know, clothing or some other medium. But quilting is not very common in France. And so there was some education there and teaching some new skills. But then I also knew I'm asking people to work with their hands. So I had made sure that I come prepared with different types of equipment, and I wanted to be mindful that people might not be able to hold scissors or might not be able to do all those workshops. So, but I didn't have cemented exactly how was I going to leverage that. And one of the things that we came up with was that, you know, there were some women on the side who were like, my hands, I got to take a break, or my hands are hurting. And, or they weren't able to stand or something like that. And they were kind of playing around with these small bits. And so depending on if it was scissors or a rotary cutter that was just kind of locked out, we started to take the excess fabric that we weren't going to incorporate into these larger rings and created what I call fabric confetti. Now I've done this like with the other pieces I've done before. Sometimes I'll make whole pieces out of confetti and do kind of like paint with these chips. But I wasn't planning on doing it for this because I wasn't using batiks, and I had only done that with batiks because the fabric is the same on the front and the back. But then I realized like the sport fabrics, the way it's dyed and manufactured, it is also the same front and back. So why can't, there's no reason I can't do that. So they were off on, so I'd have like one table prepping these rings, and I'd have another table working on making fabric confetti so that I could layer it in between some of these, and layer it in between the quilt sandwich. And that ended up being one of the best surprises and really added so much color, like literally, but also like figuratively to this piece. Because I mean, ultimately this was still a senior center that was, you know, a government run institution, and the walls are gray, you know, and this was something that just, it was so colorful. Like, who doesn't love confetti? It's like essentially fabric sparkles.
I
And
love that.
it was so fun. And it was fun to make, and all the women are chatting and like hanging out. It's something you can do mindlessly. So I thought it was also making accessible that like quilting bee experience.
Yeah,
You're
definitely.
just kind of chatting with your friends and like getting stuff done, but you don't have to, it's not like high level like thinking, but you're doing it, you're part of a community, you come together around it, and it's really fun.
That is great. And that's great that you really did think about like accommodating all those people. And then your technique just was perfect for that.
Right. And so it wasn't even something I expected, but it ended up being really fun.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So I think on the next
What's
slide.
the language difficult? Did you have difficulty with them
So the
telling
first couple
people?
of days, I was really grateful to have some IOC staff there because they were asking a lot of really good questions, not just about me, but also um, quilting in general, because I think a lot of international people understand that quilting has actually existed in a lot of different forms across the world. But quilting in America is like a very special kind of offshoot. And they know some of it, but like understanding the context and what it means, doing these different things, like explaining, the pioneers and revolutionary quilts, and then also t-shirt quilts, like how and why. So I actually at one point used to be very fluent in French, but when you don't use it every day, it kind of disappears. But then on top of that, I didn't have this like very technical vocabulary, so it was super helpful they were there. But as I worked with these women every day and I was using the metro and I was buying croissants and I'm like walking around the streets, a lot of it came back to me. So I could talk about myself and my experience. And by the end, we had this kind of like English French mashup that worked out really well. And I think also too, once you just start spending time with people, you get to understand where they're coming from. So it ended up working out pretty well.
That's good. Grace, I hate to say this, but I think we're going to have to start thinking about time a little bit.
And we're
So,
nearing the end of it. So you can speed through the other ones because that's mostly the meat of it.
oh,
So this is me when I was talking about with that confetti, layering it between between the tool and the
you laid
foundation I had made.
over it, and
Mhm.
that's how you stitched it down in place.
Yes. So this is at that sewing center. So like I would go and do these passes back and forth, sprinkling the confetti in there. Um, Lower right-hand corner is me kind of assembling those rings. And then also, I had to be really intentional with logos because the Olympic experience there's a lot of brands, right? They're on every single piece of clothing, and there are a lot of rights and copyrights and branding guidelines that I had to follow. But those are also part of the story and one of those identities that we use to come together around things. So they're actually all incorporated in this piece, but I had to be really intentional with like cutting them apart and putting them in different places. So I can see some more of them here now, but I can, if I'm mindful, I can point out the like Wisconsin W or some of the US rowing things that I know, but then also some of these bigger sporting brands are all in there as well. But it was definitely a good process, a lot of rearranging, but definitely ended up as a good product by the end.
I love that confetti sparkle. I think that is great, and it's so beautiful and bright.
Yeah, it definitely was added a lot of fun. But then in the next slide, I think I sort of let's see what's there. Yeah, that's a little bit more of those details that I was talking about. And on the long arm, it ended up being kind of heavy. I forgot. It's like imagine you're just like carrying like loads and loads of laundry that's sport fabric. It can be heavy. But I used anything that a needle could punch through. Shoelaces, swim caps, gloves. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. So it's a little bit like Applebee's going in there, and there's like all that stuff on the walls, and everyone picks out something different. But it's all textiles. It's all woven. So that's kind of was
You
my
included
parameters.
everybody. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it.
But then the next slide kind of, it's all downhill from here, I promise, in a good way. But the beautiful thing was that, it was literally, it was a lot of work, like you said, to get it all together on time. But I finished that last stitch of securing the rings to it, and I zipped it off the long arm, and we got into an Uber, and we showed up to the senior center because we had this reveal meeting, and it was so cool. Maybe I'll share the video with you too. But the women hadn't seen the finished piece. They hadn't ever seen it with the background, and they were all in different spaces. So it was this big countdown moment. We unveiled it and they were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we made this. And what I love is the first thing that they did was they wanted to touch it because they had all had a hand in it. And they were like, I remember cutting this piece, or do you remember when we were talking about that? Or, and people felt this immediate connection and ownership, this shared ownership. No one person owned this. I didn't. this was made with like a bunch of people. And the fabrics were not, some of them were mine, but there are stories there that are ours from the room. There's mine. There's the people we don't even know who donated this clothing. So it was really a cool experience to sort of talk all about it during that. So we have a quilt label here that they all signed. But that was really cool. So this is the last time I had seen them at this reveal, and I was gonna kind of assemble it, kind of bind it up, and then deliver it a few days later. But then since then I haven't seen it. So next time I'll see these people in these photos is when I'm in Paris, because we'll all see it fully finished and hung in its display space, and it'll go into the Olympic collection.
That is just amazing. What a fabulous project. I just love it. And I think it just says so much about the Olympic spirit. And I think that's what is just so, I don't know, just so heartfelt about the Olympics. I love the athletes. I love the work that they've done. But I think that the fact that it can bring everyone in the world together and in a celebration, how fabulous is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think you can keep clicking, and then I think I've got maybe only one or two more slides left. But this is kind of that overview of what it looked like, just so you can see some of the colors and the text and the print. And it was important to me that I have it be a certain size, because clothing is a human scale. Like the font size is a specific dimension. So I couldn't go too small. You'd lose it. If it was too big, it was untenable to make within a week. But this is kind of, it shows you can people spot different things. It says Taekwondo in there from a Taekwondo jacket. There's Olympic rings in there from the test events. There's a cycling shirt. There's a rugby jersey. There's a t-shirt from my last World Championships. There's clothing tags. There's all kinds of stuff in there. So what I love about it is I think people pick up different things, but I think they look at it and they largely just, like you were saying, realize that even though we might be watching an individual athlete pursue something and they're on a podium, that's really not the point. It's all about how we come together over a pursuit of excellence. And that's a group effort always. And so I think there's a lot of connection made through this piece that I'm really proud of.
Definitely. Definitely. Are you going to continue to do artwork? I mean, are you inspired now to put more time into quilting?
Oh my gosh, yes. And kind of more like this, where it's more opened up to other people. Like I've always recruited others to like help me do some stuff, because I think people are naturally curious and naturally creative, but sometimes don't have the hobby or craft to like funnel into it. So, even if I'm knitting, people are like, what are you doing? What you making? People want to help. I think that's kind of a natural instinct. So what I loved about this is, I can see me applying this to other workshops where I can bring a group of people together, if it's around, an event, a team, a school, a business, a brand, a family, like it doesn't matter. Because we all have different layers and identity and how we relate to each other. And for better or worse, we probably have a t-shirt that talks about it. So like, it's kind of cool that you can foster that through this kind of thing. And then also there's, be environmentally friendly, kind of lock it up in a piece that gives you kind of something to refer to. So I really hope I get to do more projects like this. It was a blast. It was cool. I could make something so big on that scale. And I hope it's the first of many.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that, because I really think you're onto something here. And I think the result is stunning in its own right, just as a quilt and as a piece of art. But I just love that it just has those layers of meaning to it. Mm-hmm. Fabulous. Well, let's see, we got one more. There we go. And there is all of your information if people want to contact you, follow you on Instagram. I know that by the time we show this, the Olympic announcing will be done, and you'll be hopefully just enjoying yourself, I think, towards the end of the games, and enjoying all of the hard work that you've put into just not your professional position, but also your artistic position with this fabulous Olympian Artist program. I just love that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me and talking about this project. It's definitely, from where you've talked to me now, I haven't even left yet, and the craziness has already begun. But I'm really excited to just be part of that Olympic experience in a new capacity. I went through it as an athlete, but now I feel like I've actually gotten to invite more people into that. And so I hope it's all.
Maybe your focus isn't quite so narrow and you're not worried about your event, so you can enjoy it a little more. I mean,
100%, 100% for sure.
Oh, well, Grace, thank you so much. I know you're so busy and we appreciate you giving us this time so much. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Wow, everybody. Well, I just still have the biggest grin on my face. I enjoyed Grace's conversation, all the information she shared so much, and what a fabulous project. The quilt is shown at, as Lucy said in the chat, at Clubhouse 24, but I have a feeling, and I did not clarify this with Grace, but I believe it's at the Olympic Village in one of the hospitality spaces. So I'm not sure that it's available to be seen by the public, but the quilt will now become a part of the Olympic Museum collection. So hopefully we can see it again there, and potentially maybe it will travel at some point. It's been wonderful to have you all here with us, and I think we answered most of the questions throughout our conversation, so I don't have more questions for us today. I just feel so grateful that we were able to have that time with Grace and to learn more about this quilt, and for a quilt to be at the Olympics. How fabulous is that? So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Do be sure and join us next week. And did you notice that Grace made sure she had her quilt labeled? So next week when the Quilt Alliance is on with their labeling advice, we'll all be able to learn more from them and about how important that is. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you next week.